Up to this point, we've really been drawing just objects. And we need to really start moving away from drawing just objects. And what I mean by that is we need to think about the difference between drawing and design or sketching versus composing. The quote by Bert Dodson in his book Keys to Drawing says, "The difference between sketching and designing is that the former is concerned with things, while the latter is concerned with the relationships between things. Design or composition goes beyond drawing objects to drawing the whole pattern and considering the entire piece of paper. We all have a sense of what it means to compose in this way." And I've got a few ideas to get us to start thinking about composition. This is something that we're going to continue to talk about through the semester. First, composition is really about the building blocks of a picture plane. And those building blocks are the shapes, which include those of the subject and of the background. So this goes hand in hand with what I was talking about in terms of negative space. When we're drawing something, we want to draw the negative space as much as we draw that thing. And that's also true of our arrangement of the drawing on our piece of paper. It's a series of positive and negative shapes. And so we need to think about those things as well, right? We need to draw those things. We need to include those in our drawings. The second point here is a good design grows out of a sense of wholeness and is expressed in the relationship of the parts rather than in the skillfulness of rendering any particular part. So I think about this again in terms of that idea of sketching and composing. If I'm sketching something, I'm concentrating on perhaps an object or a figure. I'm concentrating on one thing, and I'm not thinking about that thing in space, right? I'm either problem solving, trying to figure out what I'm seeing through drawing, or I'm just trying to represent that thing. In composition, we need to think about that thing in relation to everything else that's in our picture plane. So rather than, say, mentally secluding one thing, we need to think about our drawings more like our cameras. We take a picture of something, but we are also capturing all of the space around that thing. On the left, you see a quick little sketch where they've reduced the picture to a simple pattern of shapes to help think about the organization of those shapes within the drawing, right? This can help accomplish thinking about composition and start to make that difference between seeing something as a sketch versus as a drawing. Another way to think about our arrangement is like a puzzle picture of shapes, right? Quote, "The visual world is a vast and unbounded collection of shapes, but a drawing of that world is more like a picture puzzle. It's a number of shapes within a given border." So we are drawing within what is called the picture plane, right? Our either limitations are the edges of the paper, or if we draw a small border within, we're drawing a little rectangle that's a little smaller than our whole page. That is our picture plane. That's what we need to be arranging within. So what you see that I've done here is I've taken the painting Sunday Morning on the Hudson, and I have broken it down into just simple shapes. So I've traced around kind of the foreground shapes. I've traced around the middle ground, and then I've also traced around the background, right? And those simple two-dimensional shapes that are defined by outline are all now pieces that fit together within the picture plane. They are our picture puzzle. Here's another example that I've also broken it down into shapes, and this time I've added values or tones. Some of the shapes that we are looking at are going to be objects that we're drawing, of course. But just as important to your picture are the shapes of the spaces between, behind, and extending to the borders of your paper. They are really the supporting information. They're the context. They are the grounding of the the primary forms, right? These background shapes can easily escape our detection. But as we start to become more sensitive, we need to recognize how important they are, and we need to draw them so that our drawings become as much about design, composition, and arrangement as it is about capturing any one thing, right? So instead of now thinking about drawing objects, we need to consistently think about drawing space, right? Even if our focus is an object, right? In this particular drawing, you can see that the artist has really beautifully rendered this imaginary image. And they put it right in the center of the picture plane. And so on the bottom right, you can see my example of reducing that to positive and negative. And the positive shape is really what we pay attention to. The negative space really isn't anything we pay attention to. In fact, it's unimportant and uninteresting. So the artist is asking us to focus on just this object, but where it is in space really isn't part of the focal point at all. So consequently, the arrangement is pretty static and it's fairly uninteresting, right? It's very simple, straightforward. Now, I'm not saying that this is a bad thing. What I am saying is that I want you to become more sensitive to this so that when you choose to do this, it's not by default that you're no longer thinking about the negative space. It's that you're aware of it and that by your choice, you're saying it isn't important to what I'm representing, right? For me, I want to see you learn, quote unquote, the rules so that you then understand how to break the rules, right? And so that's what most artists do as they're beginning drawing is they put the focal point right in the center. They don't think about the space at all. And so, the space typically is fairly uninteresting, and that almost always makes the drawing itself pretty uninteresting. It can also have a tendency that if you're drawing objects, those objects can feel like they're floating on the page and they have no grounding whatsoever. That doesn't mean you have to put as much loving detail in the background or the negative space as the foreground or the focal point, but you do have to address it. And sometimes that means even just a few simple lines is enough to not only ground the object, but also define the negative space. This painting by John Curran, I think, is a really great example of how negative space can be an integral and active part of your picture without needing a lot. You can see it's fairly empty. We get maybe a subtle shift from light to dark in the picture plane, but that's about it. And Curran has curiously moved the figure off to the left side of our picture plane. And by reducing it to just black and white, we see how the shapes that are there, both the positive shape and the negative shape, and their shared edge, both of those shapes are pretty interesting compositionally. And so it makes it feel much more unified. It makes the figure feel like they're part of that space, right? There are also certain questions that we could be asking about this work as well. I think that's true of any good work of art. We have to almost approach it a bit like a detective. Why did they make this choice? Why didn't they just put the figure right in the center? And what effect visually, psychologically, emotionally does that choice have? How do we read this image because of that choice? Right? That gets into content and subject matter, right? But if we think about it just purely formally, as shapes, it makes a really wonderful integration between the two, and they're equally interesting. What you see in front of you is just a couple little cardboard boxes that I set up on the floor in my house. And I took several photographs of them, trying to think about, well, what would make a good composition, right? One, the boxes are at several angles. So we get this kind of series of really interesting shapes as a silhouette. 2, I thought about their placement within the picture plane. They're being cropped on the top and on the right, and that helps to divide the negative space around the boxes into more distinct forms, really 2 distinct negative space shapes in this case. And I think if you stare at both the photo of the boxes and the positive and negative shapes of the boxes in the space, you see how there's, again, this really good integration between them and how the negative space shapes are as interesting as the positive. So arrangement becomes very much part of this as well. And this is something that you have fully under your control. Not only what are you drawing, but how close, how far away are you from that thing? At what angle are you from it? One of the things I asked all of you to do in the continuous line contour drawing was to get some forms that happen at diagonals. And if you look at your drawing, did you do that? Many of you took on this flat frontal view that, had it not been for all of the details and of intricacy of line and vibrancy of what you've drawn, the drawings are so static and terribly uninteresting because they feel so flat, so frontal, and so filled with just horizontal and vertical lines, right? If you have some diagonal lines or curving lines, it makes the composition so much more interesting and gives them so much more life, right? If you start to look at the world around you, all of the things you're surrounded by, most of the things that are in your environment are vertical and horizontal, right? And so we need to think about this idea of arrangement in terms of composing our picture plane, right? So here we've got 4 bricks in 4 different, or in 2 different compositions, 2 different arrangements, right? The one on the left, we still to get some sense of 3 dimension because we get a little bit of the edge and a little bit of the top, but for the most part, it's pretty static, right? And if you look at the negative space, pretty boring and uninteresting. Not really integrated at all. The focus is all about just those bricks. The focus is still on the bricks on the photo on the right, but now we have this series of angles that do a number of things. 1, it creates a much more dynamic, moving still life. Our eyes move around the picture plane much more. 2, the negative space, again, is as interesting as the positive shapes. And 3, it feels so much more 3-dimensional because we get more of those planes and angles going on. So from here on out, I want you constantly thinking about the picture plane and the picture puzzle of shapes that are within your arrangement, right? So you're going to do a couple of drawings next. I want you to make a drawing where you are thinking about the composition. So you'll make actually 4 little drawings of the same thing, but moving around, thinking about, okay, would it be a better drawing from here or from there? If I'm a little higher or a little lower or off to this side or that side, if I get in closer, if I pull back, all of these things, again, are a series of choices. In fact, you should think about all the drawings you make as just that. It's a series of choices you've made. And so it becomes a question, why this choice versus that choice? And if we make several quick sketches, then we can go through those kind of ideas very quickly and think about the choices that are our possibilities, right? We also want to think about, again, does this make an interesting arrangement within my drawing? One way to do that, certainly, kind of extending this idea of filling in the negative space and leaving the positive white, you could do sketches like that where you break down what you're looking at into positive and negative space, and you can really clearly and quickly see, do I have a pretty interesting arrangement here? Do I have interesting negative space shapes and interesting positive shapes, right? We can also do this with line drawings, right? more than one way to kind of visualize this. Let these sketches be quick and loose and be all about trying to determine, is this an interesting composition? Last image. We've got a student drawing on the left that's all very neutral kind of outlines, a very dynamic composition, not just because it has such a complexity of shapes and forms, but because of the direction, the angle those forms are going, and again, the integration between the positive and the negative. So the negative space representation on the right, where all of those negative voids have been filled in with black ink, the drawing is still incredibly interesting, even without all of the kind of nuance and detail of the positive shapes. We can do this with all kinds of things. Figures, geometric objects, organic forms, you name it. Let your focus be, is the composition, is the arrangement interesting? I'm going to go through much more compositional information as the semester progresses, because this is just the tip of the iceberg, this idea of positive and negative. So start thinking about it with every drawing you do.